All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll hand it over to Bradley in case there's anything, to Bradley and the co-chairs in case there's anything that either of you want to say to kick things off.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a pretty busy schedule today with an important topic. I'll turn it over to Michael or Angie if they want to say anything.
Brad, I think we need to get going. Really appreciate everyone joining. And of course, I want to thank the people presenting to us. It's really delighted that we will have this type of exchange to allow us get well informed as we make progress. So back to everybody, let's get going.
All right, okay. So today we are going to be talking about reuse and refill. Just to start us off as usual with some housekeeping, please, if you are an advisory council member, put your name and affiliation in the chat. And if you put your name and affiliation in the chat before the recording started, if you could do so again, that would be great. And then please remain on mute and use the raise hand function. So the agenda for today is going to start off with us discussing kind of the theme for our discussion, and then we'll give a brief overview of reuse and refill in the statute. We'll have some presentations and then subsequent discussion with the advisory council, and then finally end with a public comment period. Okay, so the overarching theme of this discussion is going to be what should go in regulations versus what perhaps is better suited for the program plans versus what maybe should instead go in guidance. And so just to give us a brief overview of some things to consider in each of those categories. Regulations take a long time to adopt, so it's a long-term adoption process. They're not very expeditiously updated, so the updating process also takes time. Public comment periods are a mandatory part of that process, so getting that feedback through that official process is required. They are a bit more restrictive, as in they don't go into a lot of the details that perhaps a guidance document would go into. And then advisory council feedback is considered through the conversations that we're having, such as these. In program plans, these are completed by a producer or the producer responsibility organization on behalf of a group of producers. They are approved by the department, so there is an approval process that goes through the department, and advisory council feedback and consultation is required for those as well. And there could be a relatively long-term implementation process from the time that it's approved until when it's effective, just something to keep in mind. And updates can occur, but require approval. And then finally, guidance documents can be updated at any time by the department, and they are more descriptive. They go into some more details that perhaps regulations don't go into. All right. So to give us all some background, make sure we're on the same page, here's the definition of reuse and the definition of refill from statute. These are a bit long. I would be happy to read through them, or I can put them back up on the slides later if anybody needs me to go back to these, but I'm not going to read through them at the moment. I want to highlight that there is a lot of overlap between the two definitions. Everything in green here is overlapping language, but there are some key differences that are bolded here. And I won't spend too much time on this slide, just to transition over here to a breakdown of those similarities and differences. So some things that are the same in both of those definitions is that that covered material is continued. There's a continued use of that covered material. It's intentionally designed and marketed. It reduces demand for new production of the covered material. It's supported by adequate logistics and infrastructure that provide convenient access for consumers and compliant with applicable federal, state, and local statutes, rules, ordinances, etc. However, some things that are different are who is continuing to use the material. So that in the definition of reuse, that's the producer or service provider. In the definition of refill, we're talking about consumer, the consumer continuing to use that material. The definition of reuse highlights use multiple times for the original intended purpose without a change in form. The definition of refill is slightly different. It talks about repeated filling of the covered material. And then reuse specifically mentions that it must be designed for durability and maintenance to extend its useful life. That's language that's specific to reuse. And reuse logistics and infrastructure must be provided at a retail location by a service provider or on behalf of or by a producer. So that's some other language that's specific to reuse. There are several places where reuse and refill show up in the statute. So thinking about the impact of these terms and how they're defined, reuse comes up in the needs assessment. Frequently, there are many components of the needs assessment that are focused on reuse. It comes up in the definition of a covered service and the definition of recycling, as well as some other definitions like exempt materials. And this third point here under reuse is key. It's very central to the statute. It comes up in that section 2502, which describes the law's framework. So there's a big focus in statute on reuse outlined in the framework of the law. It also comes up in alternative collection and producer responsibility plans, service provider reimbursements, and annual reporting. Refill also comes up in the context of service provider reimbursements, and it's also brought up as an exception to the requirement that the program will be paid for without consumer-facing fees. So there's some specific language in there that talks about refill system related fees. So I do want to note that this is not a complete list. Perhaps there are other places where these terms might show up, but I wanted to highlight a few things and highlight how that there's a lot going on for reuse. Reuse is a bit more expansive in the law. It's brought up a lot more often. Refill is a little bit more limited in terms of how it's brought up in the law. And just to get you guys, those of us joining on the same page about some of the places where those terms are showing up. So with that background, I am going to kick it off to our first presenter, who is Upstream. Mel, I'm not sure if you're on this call.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Great. Okay. Yes.
Awesome. Cool. Well, it's good to see everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present. My name is Melissa Young. I'm the policy officer at Upstream, which is a US-based nonprofit that works across the US and Canada to advance reuse. And one of the main ways we work towards advancing reuse is advocating for strong reuse provisions in EPR. And I think I will say next slide. Thank you. Well, so Sarah already went over this. I wasn't sure if she was going to or not, so I wanted to have a slide in here just in case, because we all know how important reuse or how important definitions in EPR can be. And with reuse and refill, one of the most important things is distinguishing between what is reusable packaging and what is refillable packaging. And the Maryland statute did a really great job of that. And I was going to go into a little more detail, but I'll mostly just reiterate that returnable reusable packaging is packaging that is consumed by, or is, owned by the producers and returned to producers, whereas refillable packaging is packaging that's actually owned by the consumer and designed to be refilled at home by the consumer and has very little producer involvement except for potentially purchasing concentrates or other substances to refill those packages. And so next slide, please. Awesome. So while Maryland did a really great job distinguishing between reusable and refillable packaging in the definitions, we do feel like the statute is missing one other very important definition, which is waste reduction. We were happy to see that Maryland requires a reuse rate, a return rate, and a waste reduction goal. However, the definition for waste reduction is missing. For the reuse rate and return rate, though only the returnable reusable packaging, the things owned by consumers, will count towards these goals. Where refillable packaging comes in, it should fit under the waste reduction goal, and it should be clearly stated in the definition for waste reduction that refillable packaging counts towards this goal. So we really encourage MDE to add this definition and to look at Minnesota's definition for source reduction as a strong example of how it could be structured. Next slide, please. We also would really like to see stronger financial incentives for reusables within the program fee structure. These are missing in the Maryland statute. First, reusables, sorry, that's supposed to say base fees. The little smiley face got moved a little when I sent it over, I guess. For base fees, reusables should only be charged once. This is the main incentive that you can give for producers to switch to reusables and to also maximize their return rates. You can see that this has been codified in Oregon, Minnesota, and Washington. It's not applicable in Colorado or California because reusables are exempt. And in Maine, reusables are being fully regulated through the alternative collection program. So Maryland is the only state right now where this is applicable that's missing this provision. And then there's the opportunity through the eco-modulated fees. Through these fees, the cost to introduce reusables should be lower than the cost to introduce single-use packaging. This allows reusables to become more cost competitive with single-use. And you can see also that this is codified in all the other states that currently have EPR laws except for Maryland. And then we have a little bonus if you wanted to go even further through the eco-modulated fees to make sure that you provide greater incentives for high-performing returnables, meaning returnables that have high return rates versus refillable packaging. Next slide, please. I would also just like to point out with this slide that MDE could require the PRO to invest a minimum percentage of the program budget into reuse infrastructure and systems. This is happening in Oregon and Washington. Ideally, these pooled program funds would go towards a shared interoperable system that leverages the recycling system to actually collect and sort reusables as well. It's just really important to know that without investments in reuse systems, it's going to be really difficult for reuse to scale across the state. And then next slide, please. And then the last thing I would just like to mention is just to caution not to over-regulate reusables. We don't need to make reuse any harder. There's currently no standardized reuse is currently not standardized, and there's no third-party certification for reusables at this time. However, these things are coming. PR3 is currently working on a suite of reuse standards. 2 of the 6 have been published. One was a washing standard, and the other will be a container design and performance standard. They're hoping to have those out by the end of this year or early 2027. And so at this time, it's really just important to not put more regulations on reuse than what we really are able to understand at this point. So with that, I tried to make sure I could keep it at 5 minutes, but I'm happy to connect with anybody after this call, or if we have time for question and answer, but otherwise I will send it back to Sarah.
Yeah, we absolutely have time for question and answer. If anyone has any questions, go for it. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, Scott DeFife with the Glass Packaging Institute. I don't really have a question. I just appreciate the presentation. I'd like to follow up with you offline, on some of these things, especially the standardization issues and things like that I know I've talked with other people at your organization about before. So.
Awesome. Yeah, and I can, I don't know if I have access to the chat, and I can drop my email in there for anyone who'd like to follow up later.
I mean, there's a question here in the whole system of the EPR is exactly what can EPR handle when it's primarily curbside. And we need, especially for refillable and reusable, you need something that's not curbside, something that's not going to go in a truck with a hydraulic press and get crushed. So there may be things that we need to consider in the regs. And I'm not going to use some of the words that I use that set some of my other fellow advisory board members into connections. So I'm going to avoid that. So.
Yeah, go ahead. And then Martha.
Hey, Melissa. Just wanted to get your thoughts on, so reuse is still sort of maturing, I guess, but there still are some niche places for that reuse occurs at scale. And I guess I'd just be intrigued to get your feedback on considerations that the program plan should have and the program should have in how to make sure that we're not adding additional burden without benefit to those programs that may be functioning already in the marketplace.
Do you mean like functioning already in Maryland?
Correct.
Yeah. Well, refill is completely different than returnable reusables, right? So I don't know if there would be any additional burden on refills in terms of.
Sorry, I meant reusables. Reusables. So you'll have, I'm sure there's companies that are operating that provide water jugs or that provide, there's all kinds of pressurized cylinders that are on return systems. Like there's examples obviously in the economy that are already operating, that operate at scale. So I guess I was just trying to think as to any thoughts on how do we make sure that we're not creating additional barriers or issues for those existing programs?
Yeah, Peter, I might have to talk to Sydney about that and get back to you.
Okay, thanks.
Are any hands still up? I know, Martha, you had a hand up.
Yeah, so thanks for the presentation, Melissa. You made a passing comment about eco-modulation fees. When it comes to reusable, whether it is bulk or just for individual, what I call personal parts, the European PPWR, which I'm sure you've heard of, really talks about, when it comes to eco-modulation, considering the type of material that is being reused is very important. They give you credit. For instance, if you look at glass, plastic, aluminum, they all fit the thing. But with aluminum, because you can recycle it almost indefinitely, right? They give you some type of break when it comes to eco-modulation. Have you guys thought about something like that to make sure that we are really adopting a comprehensive approach to how we look at all these materials while encouraging, regenerative practices is really where that one was heading. Have you guys thought about that?
Yeah, well, our stance on it is pretty much that reuse is better than any kind of single use. So regardless of the material that the reusables are being made of, they should have lower fees because they're already beating out a reusable plastic cup is going to beat out a single use plastic cup, right? And so just being reusable to start is already kind of one step above. But then I do think there are different layers you can put into the eco-modulated fees as well, depending on what material and how long it has the ability to be durable and stay in the system as another layer of incentives.
Yeah, and that's what my question is really all about. No question that when you talk about regenerative systems, avoiding virgin of any type of material is critical. But I was just thinking if you had any type of inkling on how you, when it comes to this issue of reusable material, making sure you encourage people to do, get to as regenerative as possible. Because you, for instance, I'm just giving an example with aluminum. You can recycle it almost with ad infinitum, so to say. So that's really something we need to think about.
Yeah, well, I will say, Michael, it's a very timely question because we are actually, the materials question for reusables is something that Upstream is beginning to really focus on. We're going to be working this year to convene a bunch of players in the reuse world and outside to have this conversation. But at this moment, we don't necessarily have a hierarchy of material for reusables to say necessarily one is significantly better than the other.
Okay, but what I would also ask, leave in passing is it might be important to involve some of us who can help actually have that discussion ongoing, because we want to make sure that we do what I call a real collaborative architecture of whatever we're doing so that people don't feel burdened unnecessarily. Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
But Mike and Mel, can I just jump in really quickly because I want to make sure we all circle back onto this topic. Are you, Mel, I'm sorry, Mike, are you recommending or suggesting anything specific to regulations on reusable materials, specifically those that can be refilled, should have a specific regulatory fee structure versus not? I just wanted to make sure I circle back on that regulation versus in a plan versus in guidance.
I think it should be in an overarching plan. The different or rather the details can be worked out later, but recognizing that there are materials you can reuse indefinitely, because we're talking about a circular economy. A truly regenerative system should give some consideration to materials that you can continue to either reuse, recycle. You can regenerate it multiple times. I'm not saying that you should really say don't do any of those. All of them are perfect. But the bottom line is this is the type of thing that would allow us to have a comprehensive guidance on how we really drive towards a truly circular economy. If we don't address that, it'll be a remiss. Because at the end of the day, you still want that incentive to be there. You might work it out later, but it is important to keep it there so that the idea of giving people recognition or rewarding them for doing the right thing optimally should be what we encourage as an entity. That's where I'm coming from. But that's the type of conversation we need to have to really build a robust system where we're doing our, our EPR work. Does that help, Shannon?
I think we just want to make sure that we talk about things in this specific call, what we feel should be rulemaking versus what should be program plan related, and then also in guidance. I think you touched upon all of those, But I
Yeah.
just want to make sure that as we talk about topics, there is a lane for all of this. We'd love to get the advisory council's input as we address that. And Martha, I think you were next.
Yeah, thank you. Do any of the other EPR for packaging bills incorporate targets for reusables? And where would what bucket would that be in? I guess it's Shannon. What, guidelines, so forth, the three categories you have. And I also wanted to point to Kitty McElroy's point here about existing refillable packaging with South Mountain Creamery and so forth to look at, where the producers take responsibility for taking that back and reusing it. Melissa, I think that was a question for you.
Yeah, no, there are targets in pretty much every other state for reuse and return. Maine, California, Minnesota, and Washington all have them. The way that I'm not sure exactly if this is regulations or the program plan. I know that the targets are required in the statute, but they're supposed to be proposed by CAA. So I think that would probably come in the program plan. But targets they're pretty common across all the states. Colorado doesn't have targets because reuse is exempt. Reusables they're not a covered material. And I think Oregon might have just missed it potentially. So sorry if I know the first part was a question for me. I wasn't sure if the second part was a question for Shannon or if I fully answered your question.
You did. I think the second part was for Shannon.
Could you clarify what that question was, Martha, just to make sure?
If one were to incorporate targets, I mean, I know that it could be through the plan, but if one could incorporate targets, could that be done in regulation or?
So we could include targets in the regulation, but a target it's got movement to it. And so, just like goals can be defined usually in guidance, those are executive orders have goals and targets. The best mechanism to show if it's effective is reporting, right? Are you meeting it? How close are you meeting it? How is it being evaluated? And those are pieces that could be part of rulemaking, right? Like the required reporting. What are the evaluations within the reporting? And how is that being addressed in both the plan and then responses to that may be further provided in guidance? Is that helpful to kind of, like, rulemaking is really structured and it's very concise and it really doesn't offer a ton of wiggle room, right? Statute does have a little bit of ambiguity and then it's further refined in regulation. And then the guidance document typically supports both of those. We have another component here, which is the producer responsibility plans. And those plans would have specific thoughts on how they're going to address the components that are defined in both statute and regulation.
Thank you.
Brad?
I think Scott was before me.
Oh, thanks, Brett. Mine was mostly to continue the conversation with Shannon and you guys more than like another question for Melissa. So I can wait. To follow up on the whole thing about the fuzziness of the statute and the regs and things like that. I think there's places in the regs where they can clear up the fuzziness of the statute that lend itself to this discussion. Waste reduction might be one. There's things that the MDE is going to have to define in a more structured manner than the statute did, that speak to the potential of eco-modulation fees. The state can, have its own eco-modulation fees. It doesn't have to, Not that I'm suggesting that you should or have to, that kind of thing, but it's, you know, it's possible if there's actions the state wants to incentivize, it can put those forward in regs to bring to life concepts that are in the statute that aren't well defined. Sorry, that's all. And this is a space where I think you could potentially do that.
Yeah, just a quick question for Melissa. How would you envision, or what activities would you envision potentially being reimbursed? Because it's very different than the single use products. And so just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the main thing which is in the statute is the reuse service providers are included in as service providers. And so it would be reimbursement for collection of reusables and washing of reusables, and redistributing of reusables would be the main reimbursement that would come through the program for reuse.
Yeah, go ahead, Abigail.
Hey, so I guess I wanted to just talk through what I guess are some kind of specific examples of reusables that kind of already exist in Maryland, but maybe don't have a ton of bureaucracy or regulations around them. One would be pallets, is something that gets reused a lot, and so thinking about how the structure would work for those. I know I talk about pallets a lot because it's included as tertiary. If that was on anyone's bingo card for today. The other one is reusable bags. So in Maryland, it depends on your county or your city what your bag situation is, but you may or may not have plastic bags. You may or may not have a fee on paper bags, and then there's reusable bags. And these are all scaled in different ways. And, you know, I think one part of it is that considered an alternative EPR program, because there's already a bunch of restrictions and things around it, but also there's not like a take back system or any sort of structure to the reusable bag. And that's been something we've seen has gained attention in New Jersey, for example, where any single-use bags are banned. It's only reusable bags. And I think it was like the New York Times that had an article about the amount of reusable bags that people had, and that it got to a point where even food banks weren't taking them anymore because there was just so many. And so thinking about the end of life, even of reusables, this is not me down on reusables. My members make reusables in certain instances as well, but just thinking about how does that all fit together, and tracking or not tracking. So just wanted to kind of raise those as two that are fairly familiar and don't necessarily fit into these categories. And, you know, I think it's also just worth mentioning that in some instances, what works for reusable when it comes to maybe medical, which is a much higher margin, might not make as much sense when it's related to food or something like that, which doesn't mean it shouldn't necessarily have it. I know that I'll get someone saying that, disagreeing with me if I was to suggest that, but I think also scales need to be relative to value of the type of packaging and that kind of thing too. It can't just be, it's possible, so it must be. And, you know, in some conversations around reusable food packaging, for example, you're talking about longstanding, you know, restaurants and things that don't have the room to suddenly install a whole bunch of new dishwashers when they've never had those before, because they need to have that to meet reusable expectations. So there's just and frankly then there's sanitation and safety things that get added on. So I just wanted to flag out a couple of things we've heard and discussed in other states and on this topic around the country?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I actually just put a link to a brand new fact sheet that we made at Upstream, because this is your question is we're hearing it a lot all over the place. So we made this fact sheet. If you, I think the link works. It went in kind of weird, but I can speak to the concept of reusable grocery bags, and so that's actually not under the definition for EPR considered. It's not actually considered reuse, because it's a product that's just being sold, that it like selling a water bottle, like a Hydro Flask, or whatever those big water bottles everybody has now. I can't remember the name of them. So since it's just a product itself that's being sold, it's not something that's meant to be refilled through a producer selling you additional concentrates or something like that. It actually doesn't fall under the refillable or reusable definition for EPR. And then when it comes to the pallets, I'm not sure if Tim Davis is here and if it's okay to like call him out to come and speak, but he does more of the B2B reusable work. He's with the Reusable Packaging Association, but I also know in Maryland, B2B is not covered under the business to business is not covered under the EPR law. So that also wouldn't be something that would fall under the reuse framework for EPR in Maryland.
Except for office papers, which are included, and those are transported for pallets. But yeah, otherwise you're correct, only them.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that this does add some questions, I think, for the pro. I think we are interested in that side of things. If the pallet, as that example, if it ends up going to a government building or another covered entity, what activities would we be responsible for? So if a reusable pallet ends up at a municipal or a private sector site, are we compensating for that pallet to make its way back into the reusable system? Or what would be the requirements for the pro, and how do we make sure that we're accounting for those activities as we build a plan? And does any of that need to be, I guess, speaking, Shannon, to the point of the rules? But I think ideally, to me, there's so many unknowns as we start to have this discussion. There's so many different formats of reusable packaging that are potentially out there in scenarios that I think it's helpful, I think, as we look at it, to say, what can we potentially look at through guidance or the program plan, so that we can have more conversations and we're not doing something, putting something in rule that we regret at the end of the day.
Thanks for that question, Peter. Eileen, go ahead.
Yeah, the whole arena of packaging and packaging changes, it just seems like it's still, an area that's ever evolving and changing. And I think generally in our mind, in terms of the questions of regulations, program plans versus guidance, I think at every step, you want to be sure that you include appropriate and helpful information, and you memorialize, in some instance, information. And then you move forward and can use different formats to give more detail or more specificity. To us, we know from experience that things do not happen naturally, necessarily, if folks are left to their own devices. So for us, we think in regulations, it would be the appropriate place to include language that is kind of a framework that touches on and includes overarching goals and objectives, information that provides substance that will set expectations and kind of a minimum bar for requirements, and memorializes that and is clear. And that would include, in some instances, of course, refining definitions and giving a lot of clarity to the definitions. Then moving forward, for example, for program plans, that could get into the different items, more specific to materials, kind of how-tos for specific materials. And then moving forward from there, guidance would be providing even a greater level of detail, getting into the nitty-gritty of requirements. So we see it as sort of an evolving three-step kind of process that at every point is helpful to the public, to the affected parties, but that actually kind of steps through, kind of all as part of a kind of a network, if you will. Just wanted to share that with the group as a concept that that we kind of ascribe to, but I think would be very applicable and helpful in this EPR process, particularly because things are ever evolving and changing. Thanks.
Thanks, Eileen. Go ahead, Mario.
Good afternoon to everybody. So I just wanted to, excuse me, circle back on the pilot conversation and speak about that from a retail standpoint. That has long since been a major concern, because it crosses into multiple responsibilities. So most of, I'd say, 80 to 90% of deliveries to retails or grocery stores, regardless of whether they look like a big box, independent, or a club situation, most of the product that's delivered is delivered on pallets, right? And so we run into situations where your warehousing on your own retail space becomes cluttered with pallets. And so we're trying to figure out what to do with those. And sometimes we can, once a delivery comes in, we can say, hey, we got some pallets. Can you take them back and use them? Sometimes they say yes. Sometimes they say no. If they say no, then, you have to figure out how you get rid of those. Then it crosses over into what's called, illegal dumping. You have other, entities who get deliveries who don't have, a trash or recyclable situation where they figure out, they'll come to a different retail space and at a certain time at night or early in the morning, and they will offload their trash, their pallets into or beside your trash bins and your dumpsters and stuff. And that really causes an issue. And there are places along streets, if you go check them out, there are places beyond streets where illegal dumping happens there as well. So I just wanted to just kind of bring that perspective up and so the folks can really understand the pallet issue is not just, it's broader than what we might be thinking. So I just wanted to just put that out there as well. Thank you.
All right. I don't see any other hands. But please jump in if I'm missing someone. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mel, for your presentation, for sharing with the Advisory Council. We really appreciate it. And And with that, we will transition over to our next presenter.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Can you guys see my camera? Right, I'm Malek Kabesh. I'm the East Coast representative for Dispatch Goods, and we're a reuse company that primarily operates in food service for private clients. So corporations, hospitals, some schools, but usually the systems we have tend to be more contained than something you would spread across the entire state to most consumers. So I'll be speaking mainly through the lens of my experience in food service and in those environments. Martha, I said Martha Ainsworth is here, and I met her before, so her name was at the top of my mind, but I meant to say Sarah. I think I'll just stick to this one slide and speak very briefly from some notes. The first thing I wanted to add some insight towards was the definition of reuse. Something that I noticed is a lot of it talks about durability and the presence of systems, but I would like to see future language include more regulations for clearly labeled instructions in terms of how and when and where the reusable products are meant to be returned, of course, respective to each producer. And then the second thing I wanted to speak towards was design, especially looking within the framework of these larger systems, just maybe having, I don't know if this would fall more towards guidelines or regulations, but more detailed information about end of life, recyclability, and looking at the return rate to determine the initial material that's going into the development of whatever product you're putting out there, essentially with the goal of minimizing the material input relative to the reuse performance. And then the final thing I wanted to speak towards was the reporting for reuse. From what we've seen at Dispatch Goods, like, yes, we measure waste and carbon reduction, but I think return rate is a much better indicator of how the system is operating. So maybe adding some language regarding that and setting those frameworks, especially when it comes to determining the reimbursement rates and stuff for eco-modulation. And that is all. Any questions?
Thanks so much.
Of course. Yes, Peter.
Maybe I'll ask a quick question as I just wanted to, so are your, is your reusable packaging, is it generally used within closed settings? So used within like a stadium or a cafeteria, or is it materials that are largely taken home and then returned at a later point?
I guess I would say it's primarily closed settings, like the material is going off site. So if we're operating at a corporate campus or even a university, a lot of people are taking the containers back to their dorms or different floors or to their homes for dinner. And then I guess like bringing them back later. So that the difference here is you can kind of guarantee that most people eating at these sites are going to be frequenting them later, not necessarily on a daily basis, but there is some sort of cadence there. We do operate at a few publicly facing cafeterias, that are like open to the public. And we have seen slightly lower return rates there, but I think because most people are repeat customers, it stays pretty high.
And I'll just point out that outside of dispatch goods, our world are the two primary reusable food serviceware containers that are operating within the state of Maryland currently. And they have their own washing systems, the centralized washing systems. So just to put that as a context of where dispatch goods is sharing information, and then our world is the other one that is primarily located in Maryland. There are some that kind of touch on the exteriors and come for other events, but those are the two primaries.
All right, well, don't feel limited to asking questions to our presenters at this time. If others come up throughout the meeting, if they're both still on, feel free to ask them as we move forward. But we are going to go now into the discussion questions that were sent out to the Advisory Council. And thank you so much, Mel. And is it Malek?
Malek.
Malek, thank you so much. Okay. So again, it says regulatory framework here, but again, we are trying to understand what may be best placed in regulations versus a program plan versus guidance. So the first topic is producer responsibility plans. The intent of the law, the framework of the law is to minimize the environmental and human health impacts of packaging, including redesigning packaging such that it is reusable in addition to recyclable and compostable. And so our first question is, should rules be established to address any eco-modulation factors for reuse? So we're talking about eco-modulation for reuse, given that it's part of the main framework of the law. And I know that this was addressed to some extent in the presentations that were just given, but if anyone has thoughts specific to this topic, please feel free to jump in. Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, I mean, one of the requirements of the program plan is for the pro to develop eco-modulation factors as part of the program plan. So I guess my question is it needed in rule, or could simply, if the desire of the advisory board is that that the program plan should include after we've discussed it, couldn't the direction just come through the advisory council rather than through rule?
Go ahead, Abigail.
I'm thinking my question is better suited for later in the discussion. It doesn't really fit into eco-modulation. So
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, and so I think, Peter, going back to your question, yeah, I think we are trying to understand maybe what could be placed in regulations as well. So like, is there any language that needs to be placed in regulations that says, something needs to go in the plan, for example? Perhaps, I'm just thinking out loud here, but perhaps there could be language that isn't outlining exactly what those factors would be, but that factors need to be made for this category. And then I think Heidi, I think that's Heidi who has your hand raised. I will say we do have a public comment period at the end. That's a 10-minute period.
Okay.
You're welcome to share then, and we'd love to hear.
Okay, because there's a lot that I'm probably going to want to weigh in on. I hope I didn't forget it all, but thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
I think Peter probably knows where I'm going. At the risk of, I'm not trying to complicate this. I just think if the question from MDE to the advisory board is, right, are the regs a place to try to give a hint about what the state wants, especially to fill, not to make up new things that aren't in statute, but to fill in fuzzy spots, if you will, that aren't clear in the statute. I think that it is better for everyone, the constituents in Maryland and the pro, to have a clear idea of what it needs to perform against, you know, in some regs. Whether I agree with Peter that getting too specific in the regs is probably not the best way, because the program plan can adjust, you know, can address certain things in certain ways, and has to, within the really complex math that they have to do about how to assess fees to different, you know, producers, right? But absent any sort of signal on reuse, refill, circularity, anything like that, if the state does want to incentivize those kinds of things, you probably need to speak to it, you know, in some manner, at least to give a signal to the pro to try to adopt certain things in, especially in a timely manner, right? I mean, how many different passbacks do you want, and that kind of thing. Peter and I worked on a different state. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say the work that we did on the state in this, given the fact that we're in this setting and not the other setting. But, you know, the Colorado statute wasn't entirely clear on reuse, refill, right? And so without any sort of, you know, signal from the statute or the regs, then, you know, CAA had to prioritize the things that Colorado CDPHE put in the regs first, right? And so it's really just a matter of, but on the other hand, they've got a lot of different things to do, and handling this, you know, is tough. And how many things can you get done in the first 5 years? So I think it's just really an issue for the state to decide how much they want to incentivize some of these things. And I just go back to my previous comments that where there is fuzziness in the law, you may want to, you know, put 2 cents in, if you will.
Thanks, Scott. Go ahead, Eileen.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much, I'm just going to repeat, or I hope I don't need to repeat what I last said. There should not be any fuzziness. People should understand at least the framework and minimum expectations. And that should be established in regulation. Because quite frankly, aside from this group, no one else is all that interested in what the EPR group has discussed, or, you know, or is what the thoughts behind discussions were. And so we should not, no one should rely on that. I think it needs to be clear, it needs to be clearly stated, and it needs to be something that is a more memorialization of just the minimum expectations that every party should be able to have. And I think those are the things that belong in an MDE regulation. And then moving forward, you know, in light of needing and wanting flexibility to be able to do this in the best manner possible, and given all the different changes that happen in packaging and packaging materials, then as we move forward to whether it's the program plans and then further the guidance, I think at every step, things can get more and more specific. But there should be no one in the public should be fuzzy or unclear. Everybody should be able to clearly know what the expectations of them and of others are.
Thanks, Eileen. Seeing no other hands, I'm going to open this question up, broaden a little bit. Is there anything else generally that needs to be considered related to producer responsibility plans? having to do with reuse or refill. So not eco-modulation specific, and I know that some of the comments that were brought up were a bit broader, but I just want to open that up. Go ahead, Eileen.
Yeah, and I would just add, if it's not clear, I think some overarching language about eco-modulation, if that's what this group wants to see happen, should also reside in the regulations. And then again, moving forward to the plans and then the guidance, it could be flushed out and built out with more level of details.
Thanks, Eileen. Go ahead, Abigail.
There's been some really interesting conversations in the last few years around reuse, and some of the discussions get into the arena of, in what instances has a reuse option been designed with a long-term plan in mind, where it is adapted for multiple businesses versus heavily branded for a single business. And if they update their brand or something, then the whole lot kind of has to be tossed and it becomes a disposable item instead, and kind of the end of life of that. And discussions around testing of reusable materials and their, I think it's this language, this section has some of the least existing protocols around it. I mean, that's part of why it was valuable that you had these two speakers to start, because there's experience and there's thought there that's ongoing. But everything has an environmental impact, and thinking through whether it's eco-modulation, which I agree with Eileen, we really don't have a lot of structure for what that would look like in Maryland, or really in most of the states to even build from necessarily. Thinking about, okay, reuse, how is it reusable? I mean, gosh, I'd never realized before that Upstream doesn't consider reusable bags and reusable coffee cups to be reusable in the context of EPR, which, they're replacements for single-use packaging that EPR stuff is meant to address, but apparently because they are reusable, it's not packaging, it's a product. And how do you even capture that when you're trying to do the data processing that a PRO needs to handle? And so I think getting some more details, and also just thinking about at what point is something considered reusable. Just because it's the one I've worked on the most or thought about the most, reusable bags. In some instances, it's tied to it has to be able to be used this many times and carry this much weight, or it has to be able to be washed completely, or it has to have actual stitching. These are all different iterations that have come up in different states that have reusable bag language. And so how do you fit those together in some way, or how do you track that as a PRO or as the agency for all of the different potential iterations of reusable? And I think it comes down to, it has to be broad enough to work without it being a loophole. And I know we're the advisory council, but I guess to a certain extent, just very interested to see what the PRO and the agency come up with for this part of it, because it's very complex depending on what you're trying to replace, or maybe not replace, but have an alternative option in some of these. Because I think not every type of packaging has a viable reusable necessarily, just from like either a cost or availability and economy of scale reality. So those are some of the thoughts.
Thanks, Abigail. Any other thoughts before I move on to a slightly different but somewhat related topic? Okay, so the next topic that we're going to talk about are fees and reimbursements. I'm going to open this slide up generally. We're not going to go through each question individually, but the questions are, should there be a defined framework for reimbursement when evaluating reuse or refill? Should there be specific fees for reuse and refill? Are they based on uses per item or on material content or a combination of both? And then the last question is just considering that reusable packaging in some cases might both be a covered material that a producer is a producer for, but also that producer could be the service provider as well, who's doing the collection and the washing. Are there any specific considerations for reuse that need to be made that might need to go in regulations or the plan or guidance? So I'll open this topic up for conversation. And please feel free to ask for clarification if any is needed.
So maybe I'll start and just say, I think, you know, we're certainly interested in feedback, just given the amount of different types of reusable packaging that potentially could get covered. You know, if we're talking about potentially pallets in some cases, if we're talking about, you know, transport related packaging, if we're talking about food service packaging, it's a pretty expansive list, and reimbursement may look different in different settings. So, you know, I don't know if we would be providing reimbursement in a closed environment versus an open environment, meaning, you know, like a stadium, a municipal or state-owned stadium or something along those lines. Like, I think there's just way too many questions right now that need to be answered before we figure out what that framework looks like. So my concern is too quickly moving to rule before we kind of know what the expanse is and before we've had a number of conversations with those folks that may be operating reuse systems that are operating right now, and those that are interested in growing potential reuse systems within the state.
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I think I agree generally with Peter. There's a concept that I think probably needs to be identified, and based on some of my, I might ask Melissa if she's still here, based on previous conversations in other states that I've had with Upstream. I think there's a very strong belief that a reusable package that's introduced into the system pays once and not every single time it's used. You may want to, you know, articulate that, but how many times does that? It's very different for a clamshell at a food service institute and versus a growler or something like that, or a milk bottle at South Mountain Creamery or something like that. So leaving some flexibility in there is appropriate, but you don't want to charge. I believe the reuse advocates, you know, think it's a detriment to charge the reusable package every single time it goes through the system, different than introducing one package in that's going to get reused multiple times, because there's already inherently more cost in the take back washing stuff. So it needs to even out over or plus up over time. Other than that, I'd leave it as flexible as you can for the different elements.
Thanks, Scott. Go ahead, Eileen.
So Scott, how does one keep track of, like, if only the first party is reimbursed. I'm just wondering, how does that all get tracked?
I wasn't really talking about the reimbursement part. I was talking about the producer putting the reusable package in as a package fee first.
Oh, okay.
The reimbursement part is for service providers who then are servicing the system, right? So you're talking about people who are picking up and moving it and taking it back and stuff like that. That's a service provider contract. Yeah.
And so for that, it would be each time, potentially. Is that right?
The system's going to have to be built in the first place unless one exists. I mean, there's not that many reuse, rewashing, bottle washing, or, other washing, facilities. France has some systems that deal with institutional food service packaging, that kind of thing, right? So I think the struggle is in the US, where there's not a robust reuse system anymore, other than in certain very niche areas.
Yeah.
Infrastructure is necessary. The theoretical question is, do you ask the pro to ask all producers to put in on that in order to build it, and then individual producers come towards it? If that's what you want, you needed incentives to move it a certain way, right? Maybe the state has infrastructure money, grants and things like that that can help, that kind of thing. But, we got to piece this. If you want to support the systems, you have to figure out how to piece it together in an economic manner and make it make sense within the broader construct of the producer fees.
Right.
I'm worried less about service providers getting reimbursed. I think that takes care of itself to a certain extent.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I misunderstood. What you had been saying.
Yeah.
So what you were focused on, but I'm just going to say it again. To the first question, should there be some defined framework? Yeah, I'll just repeat what I've been saying all day. I think that, there needs to be a framework, a well-defined framework that sets goals, objectives, expectations. And I think that resides in regulations where they're best memorialized, just for everybody's sake, everyone, whether they're producers, generators, users, the general public, service providers, whomever. I think these are good questions. I frankly don't know that I possess enough right now to help answer questions, at least well. I don't know about others on the group, but I think they're good questions, but I think we need, from my perspective, I just need to better understand and kind of have my arms around a lot of different factors related to this, to these, relevant issues.
Colleen, I'm just going to speak just to give you a little bit of a background, what we are already aware of within the state, based on our experience for the food residual diversion law, as far as where there's tons of food packaging. So I am only kind of speaking on the food packaging side, so I apologize for anyone not in that scope, but just to give you a little bit of understanding. Some of our schools and our public correctional facilities do have reusable packaging that food serviceware packaging that they provide. And some of them have in-house washing. Some of them cannot do in-house washing. Sarah and I have been fortunate to sit on many of the national calls regarding food service packaging for schools. And so we are aware of the logistical challenges that occur within Maryland as an East Coast state, as opposed to the West Coast states that have a little bit more space to have dishwasher installations, and in Canada as well. We're also aware that in our public infrastructure that the state may lease out as an operational, such as, or a county, like in Howard County, you have Our World that currently has their cups as under a contract. Live Nation typically is the one that operates the facilities that occur in Howard County, but it is owned by Howard County. the Meriwether Post Pavilion. And so those are uniquenesses where there is reuse infrastructure already in place. It's in the food serviceware, and kind of just to give you like the different types of refill and reuse that already exist within the state itself. And then in our public, some of the public universities offer clamshells. Those are exactly as Malika had referred to before, where those clamshells are kind of circular in that they may go back to a dormitory, but you're going to have that repeat customer. And I recently just saw some clamshells that are reused at my local grocery store that I could use. And as a small independent grocer that was offering that option. And then you also have your glass refill from Hex Ferments, South Mountain Creamery are two of the top names that you'll typically hear as well. So just to give you the context of where food packaging currently exists within the state that are intentionally meant for refill. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Shannon. I just want to go back to Eileen's comment. I think really on the first point, I agree. Should there be a defined framework for reimbursement at this stage? Yes, because otherwise, you won't have what I call a guardrail for really developing anything in the future. The reason I say that is this. We're talking about a status quo that may not have the supporting infrastructure. But we have an ambition to get to a really circular economy where building the infrastructure will be part of it. So that's why I think the framework is good to have now. However, to Peter's point earlier, when it comes to specific fees, we should give time for us to understand how that could be worked. And as I would say, the PRO or even other experts who have a significant input to make sure that that fees makes sense. The idea here is to incentivize people to do the right thing. And when you think about packaging, I just want to say one thing that we should all bear in mind. This state, meaning Maryland, has an ambition to reduce our carbon footprint. I think that's something we're forgetting. The packaging is critical. So, if you're going to get to the carbon footprint that the state has the ambition to get to, reducing packaging is critical. Talk to any of the manufacturers or any of the CPG companies. The carbon footprint for packaging is anywhere from 9 to 11% of the overall carbon footprint. So there is no net zero whenever you guys we want to achieve that without decarbonizing packaging. That's why I say let's put framework that will lead us on a trajectory of the future, not the status quo, but in terms of the details of how the pricing or the cost will come, I think we can work through that in the future. It shouldn't prevent us from setting this guardrail. So that's really something I want to share.
Thanks, Mike. And Malek,
yes.
Thank you so much. Last time, Malek.
Like molecular. I just wanted to add some more, since we brought up the carbon footprints. I would be concerned that without a defined framework, if we're just reimbursing for reusables, that would actually contribute to increasing the state's carbon footprint due to the creation of these heavier and more carbon heavy reusable products. That was all.
Thank you. And yeah, go ahead, Peter.
And maybe I should have started with this, because I think the concern I have, or the question that I have, is so the PRO is required in the plan to develop how it is going to reimburse for reuse activities and refill activities. So it's required to do that as part of the program plan. I guess maybe what I'm struggling with is what would a defined framework for reimbursement, like what does that actually mean? And maybe that's what I'm struggling with, because we've barely broached the subject. We haven't done any consultation with the sectors in any substantive way. So I guess my concern is we're running towards trying to put something into rule that I'm not even sure I understand what it means. And so I guess that's my struggle is I don't really understand what exactly we're trying to do. And we haven't even consulted on the various types of existing systems, new systems, how we're going to support them. Like that's all part of the program plan consultation. That's all part of the work that we have to do over the next number of months. So I guess I'm not quite sure I understand exactly what this is supposed to do.
Go ahead, Eileen.
Yeah. So, I understand, Peter, what you're saying. I guess to me, again, I just feel as though we need to have kind of our overarching kind of guiding principles that are, I think, best reside in regulation. So maybe what it would be, and I don't want to get into the writing and the kind of words, but maybe what, for example, could happen. I think in the regulations, there should be an acknowledgement that one of the goals is for reimbursement for packaging that is designed for refilling and reuse over and over again, put in some of those details. And we don't need to define what that reimbursement would be, but we would acknowledge in the regulations that there will be follow-on, work to establish a reimbursement for this, because that lays the foundation. It shows that is one of the overarching goals of this, right? Of what we are trying to do. And that frankly, it's an incentive. It's in black and white, in print. It can be utilized as an incentive for people working in the packaging and manufacturing industry to start to look at this whole packaging, to shift maybe the way that they think about the packaging and the packaging products that they design and they produce for use. I know for us, putting things in regulation, even when they're overarching goals and objectives, it carries weight. And I know that it's been helpful, for example, when we had our first regulations for mixed paper and cardboard recycling, it enabled some facility, some people in the facility realm to actually try and move forward, to look at land, to look at designing infrastructure, and to get financing to build, a major mixed paper and cardboard recycling facility in the county. And so, it's really just sort of that foundational, but in print, and where somebody can point to it and know this is what the state, these are the expectations, this is where we are heading. And we want everyone to start, running the football down the field in that same direction. And, it can help in all these other ways, whether it's conceptualization, design, financing, planning, etc. And, without that, it just won't happen naturally. It hasn't yet, right? Boutique-y, as Scott was saying, boutique-y things, fringe things. Yeah. Small steps, baby steps. But if we're serious about this and we want, strides made, we just need to really start to lay the foundation by putting these things in print that everybody would be aware of and be able to start to move forward on.
Peter, I see you have your hand up, and I do want to give you a chance to respond. I also do want to note that we have a few more topics to get through, and so I would like to keep us moving along and make sure that we get to public comment. But go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll keep it, I mean, totally agree with what you're saying. I guess it's already in the statute. So I guess I'm trying to understand where the question, like those signals are already that it's a requirement in the statute for the program plan to address this issue and to deal with this issue. So I guess I'm maybe the question is back to MDE as to, is there a gap that you're indicating potentially might be there? Or is there something specifically you were trying to get at through this question?
I think, Sarah, I'll just say here, when we were talking about the framework, we're specifically asking, what kind of reimbursements should be evaluated? Where should they be? Should it be defined in rule that reimbursements are for this? This is refill, this is reuse. These are the fees that would be allocated, that would be potentially in rulemaking, or should it be slightly more vague and allow for it to be implemented through a program plan with our approval?
Yeah, go ahead, Eileen, and then we're going to move it forward to the next.
Sorry, I mean, I know you want to move us forward, but I think this is an excellent discussion, and I think it's a necessary discussion, right? But for example, in the regulation, in that framework, can also be more, a little more specific about what are the considerations that will be made, what in terms of, evaluation and establishment, what factors are going to play into considerations that will feed into establishing that reimbursement. I just think, so to Peter, to answer your question, to me, between statute and regulation, again, it's every step in the process and being a little more, providing a little more specificity as things are coming clearer into focus for us, for the EPR advisory group, for MDE, for stakeholders, just everybody, again, moving the ball forward towards what we want to accomplish.
Thanks, Eileen. And I will say that at the end, we will share our homework once again for the upcoming period. And we are looking for feedback. So I think we are looking for feedback from the advisory council if there is anything that the advisory council has identified that maybe we haven't considered. I think that's what we're looking for with that question as well. Okay, so I'm going to move us along and hand it over to Shannon.
Sure. So we had sent out an invitation to attend this meeting, kind of terms that we were looking at seeing whether it's necessary to expand on. Again, I'm going to use Scott's word. If some of these definitions in statute were a little fuzzy and they needed to have a little more clarification in rulemaking, or if there was something that could be provided with more specific suggested policy within guidance. These are some of the terms that we were looking at under the refill and reuse and what that might be. I was just out in California. My hotel had this lovely, this bottle is non-refillable and sealed, and I thought that I would share that on the screen and also to show this other picture that had been taken in a previous advisory council in-person meeting. These are some of the questions when we think about refill, reuse. What are those terms and what do they mean? And when it's non-refillable, what does that also mean? So just wanted to put that out there as far as definitions. We'd love for the advisory council to provide some feedback. If you feel like now is not the right time, because looking at the time itself, that you would like to just share this to us up towards us afterwards through an email, that is fine as well. But for that, I will leave the door open for a comment. Okay, Sarah, we can move on to the next slide. So again, we've had this lovely opportunity of participating in a lot of national calls on refill and reuse with food packaging simply because of the food residual diversion law. And so we're kind of aware of some of the holdups when it comes to refill within state public health codes. There are other things to be considered in future refill, right? So just going back from the plastics conference, one of the conversations we had there was, are there sanitation requirements if it was for a beauty product? I mean, I'm not going to say that I don't let my children go shop at some of these larger makeup stores, but I'm always saying, please don't put that on your face. And that was a comment that was iterated in this conference as well. So maybe health codes might not be as important when it comes to some of these refill opportunities. But with that in mind, we were trying to understand, are there specific references that we should put in rulemaking that do help to align what we consider to be positive in the refill and reuse space outside of maybe it's just referencing a state code or providing specific OSHA standards, if there's FDA best practices, et cetera, that can be in guidance. And we just wanted to say, if you do think that there's standards, and again, I know Mel shared some of the P3 standards that are going to be coming forward. What are those, and what should we be considering? And then the last bullet, that was specifically looking at and a question of the Advisory Council when it comes to inventory for refill and reuse, where you are going to have to overproduce a product because it is not single use. This is meant to be refilled over and over again. And when you have events that are meant for that staging, where does this get interplay as far as defined terms or standardization? And is it something we should consider in, again, or should the producer responsibility plan consider that? Should guidance consider those standards as far as the overproduction of a packaged material specifically to serve that purpose? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, Shannon, just some clarifying questions here. When you talk about any standard, are you talking about food, for instance, food safety standards, or for medical things, the health standards that are required by FDA? What are you talking about? Because most companies, say in the food business, let me talk about where I know. They have standards they have to address, food safety standards, to make sure there are no cross-contaminations and things like that in the environment. And that is, most manufacturers do that already. And I don't think there's anything that will change it. So I think a little clarification is this, so that we don't build on something, that's already in existence,
Yeah, so what we were trying to understand is within the, if there is rulemaking that's necessary, under refill and reuse, should we specifically call out that it must meet at least the minimum requirements of X, Y, and Z if you're in certain industries or not? Or is it an acceptable standard and could be incorporated into the plan itself, where the producer responsibility plans indicate that refill and reuse is fine as long as it meets these acceptable standards that you're already doing as far as X, Y, and Z, or within guidance where we just kind of list out so that others are aware potentially of existing, if there is a county code or a health ordinance specific to Maryland, because some of these can be very nuanced. Obviously, there are federal guidelines, but just we were trying to understand, should we reference those, which manner?
Yeah,
so that's helpful.
It's helpful. I was gonna call Peter. Peter, sorry to call you up. I was gonna say, Peter, do you have anything to share there before we go too deep into it?
Yeah, I think the concern is always going to be just, we don't want to provide barriers to reuse and refill. So just want to be cautious on that. But the one question I did have, Shannon, actually, when you were talking to it, the second bullet, is it meant to deal with the reusable packaging, or is it meant to deal with the activity that we may be reimbursing?
I don't. Oh, as in like that they certify, like you reimburse the certification?
Sorry.
Is that what you're asking?
Like, I guess what I'm saying is, if you've got a wash facility, does the wash facility, is the question that the wash facility, would we need to meet certain standards or no? Like, I guess that's what I'm.
Yeah, potentially it could be either or. And I think that's because this topic is so broad, right? And you have such specificity in the types of activities you're doing, it could be either or. I mean, we're not the Department of Health. We're not going to set a standard that is a Department of Health standard. So that would not be something that MDE, defines in our rulemakings, but we might point to those specific rulemakings to provide that specific guidance, if that is helpful. We do not, we obviously, we should not be reimbursing someone that doesn't meet OSHA standards, right? Like if they're required to have certain requirements, the health department may have shut them down. That would not be able to be reimbursed, but that question would be part of the rulemaking. If a service provider does not meet or has failed inspections, reimbursements should potentially be ineligible for that entity until such time that is corrected. And that could be part of the rulemaking process. That's what I wanted to help maybe point out there, Peter, if that's what you're asking. So it kind of protects the producer responsibility organization. You don't want to be reimbursing someone that isn't meeting, certain standards that are baseline, if that's helpful. But we are also specifically asking about refill and reuse if you meet, compliance standards for accessibility as well.
I guess typically this would get dealt with through some kind of commercial agreement. That makes it easier and more flexible to deal with, because you could have any type of infraction that happens with a recycling facility or reuse facility that you pulling all fees could create additional problems and could lead to situations where you're not achieving what you're actually intending to achieve. So contractually, it allows you some flexibility to make sure that the overarching goals are being dealt with. And I'll stop there because I know Scott's got his hand up.
Yeah, Scott.
Now that the conversation has flushed this out a little bit, I think I'm going to go back to some other aspects of the EPR law that I think we've talked about before. If you want to don't try to create new regs for us, like toxics in the package. If you have a toxics law, have a toxics law. If you certification, ability to operate, standards, that kind of thing, that's probably set out in statute in Maryland that doesn't need to be recreated in packaging so that you have two different dueling versions of who can operate as a service provider in the state. I mean, obviously they need to be pass inspection and things like that. I wouldn't get too specific, but reference, give the pro some tools. The statute doesn't really talk about quality standards or anything like that. I think you want to give the pro some tools to, not anybody can drive a truck around, pick up stuff on the side of the road and then expect to get reimbursed, right? I mean, I remember that discussion very explicitly during the legislative, part of the operation. I mean, you have to be a licensed, certified, entity following the laws of the state of Maryland in order to participate in this program. You don't need just rogue people out there, picking up stuff on the side of the road and saying, here, look, I'm a service provider, right? So I think the same holds true in bottle rewash, facility compliance with, all of these other, issues, ADA, OSHA, and stuff like that. I don't know that the state needs to get into the gory details of that just in packaging. I hope that helped.
Thanks, Scott. Eileen?
So I just wanted to say the word logistics is really a broad word, right? So for example, in the first bullet, adequate logistics standards, I'm not sure what that means.
Just to clarify, what we were trying to point out here is, again, we're trying to be broad by asking some of these questions. We want to give the advisory council something to talk about, discuss, and what we're kind of, mulling around. For the community standards or logistics standards, what we were trying to understand, again, looking at other producer responsibility laws, the access to reuse and where that might be. So for example, if you sell a reusable container or a reusable packaging, and the only place to refill it is 180 miles away from you, is that considered an acceptable standard for logistics, if, like to that person, the consumer, to give you that? Is that helpful, Eileen?
Yeah, I mean, I would put that in the category of convenience, but I see what you're saying. But again, that's like one prime example where moving forward, you know, I think the group's going to have to work to try and define things in a better way, because just saying logistics is not really that helpful, you know, if we put these things out there to the public. The other thing I just wanted to point out in terms of health codes, OSHA standards, ADA, FDA, etc. So there's, you know, for the state, there are health codes, of course, but then also local jurisdictions, and we can't preempt the local jurisdiction requirements. So I just want to raise that because that's kind of a big area. So yeah.
Appreciate that, Eileen.
Sure.
Sarah, let's move on to the next slide, and I'm only going to flash it very briefly because there's so much on here. But it does, one of the topics that we had listed here does harken back to the conversation that Abigail brought up earlier of how do bag bans or bag provisions in local jurisdictions impact any rulemaking that may be present for packaging. And so, and again, leaning into what Eileen had presented as well on the localized, right? How can the statewide EPR packaging and paper products reduced responsibility be integrated into local specific ordinances? And what are those nuances that we may need to adjust within rulemaking or provide through guidance? We wanted to make sure that we indicated that. And then again, is there a specific label that should be indicated on the reuse or refill? And who is that standard approval process? Obviously, there are some approaches to other types of packaging for recyclability or compostability, and they're trying to set standards. Are there ones that we should look at across the Atlantic and lean into some of their standards and what those might be? I know we are going to be short on time, so actually what I'd like to do is not open the Supervisory Council for public comment right now, but ask you to respond in email to us so that we can share this at the next upcoming meeting, unless there's something that someone has a burning comment that they have to shout out right now. Okay. So with that in mind, again, I apologize. There's a lot of good bullets up there. There's a lot of text, and we want to make sure that everyone has time to digest this. We do ask that you provide us with any recommended language or feedback on some of the topics that we discussed today, sent through the mde.epr@maryland.gov email. If you could send them to us by March 12th, then we can share them amongst the Advisory Council meetings. And it gives enough time for everyone to have some feedback if they want to consider any of those, to talk about those as well. We did this last meeting. We didn't receive any feedback from the previous one, but we wanted to give it a little bit of extra time. And with that, we're going to flash very briefly the next upcoming meetings. We will cycle back to that, but we wanted to open up the floor now to public comment. If you are, oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to jump in really quickly and then we will open it up for public comment. Just to note that the public comment period, the 30-day public comment period for the previous round of regulations that are currently going through the rulemaking process closes on March 9th. So I just wanted to make sure everyone is aware of that. If you have public comments that you would like to submit, please do so before March 9th. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, let's just open up for the public comment, and then we will leave up on the screen the next meeting dates while the public comment is happening. If you would like to add a public comment specifically on this topic or anything unrelated to the current draft regulations, please feel free to use the raise hand function. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. You know, as I read through this, I know there's a lot of discussion about moving things to recycling and moving things to composting. And I think composting is great, you know, as we focus on the waste stream. There's a lack of infrastructure for composting here. If we were to move everything to compostable materials, are there resources that we can point people to for compost hauling and where to move those materials to? Because I just want to make sure that, you know, if we're focused on trying to drive something to a solution, that there's an end solution there that the state's supporting as well. How does that work and what does that look like here?
Yeah, sure. Maryland has a list of permitted facilities that accept food residuals. Not all of them accept food packaging, but most of them do. And I will put the link to that map in the chat so you can see the entities that have that existing infrastructure. If they're smaller, just to help on this one particular, they're smaller than a certain size, and they can receive outside feedstocks as long as they're operating in a certain manner, and they might not be required to have a permit. And also, if they are specifically operating on a solid waste acceptance facility that is owned and operated by a political jurisdiction, such as a county, they also may not have this dedicated permit if it's part of that existing one. I know that's kind of a broad way to describe that, but I will put the map in the chat.
Yeah, it'll be a map that shows coverage for all counties.
Where they're located, and the solid waste infrastructure for recycling plan for Maryland, our work plan. We are evaluating the current infrastructure for food service packaging, and food residuals with the capacities in the state, and all organics, not just specifically to food. And our report is due to the EPA sometime at the end of this year. We will probably be presenting on that at the upcoming Food Summit, which we anticipate will be in Q3, Q4 of this year. And then you would really be able to see the details on hauling capacity. Kitty?
I wasn't sure if you meant to hold public comment for the previous reusable topic that you just covered. I had a comment, but is it okay? I can share it?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to say thank you for showing the photo of that bulk non-reusable pouch. I think that's something we want to make sure isn't incentivized under this program in Maryland. I've seen that at retail outlets in Maryland where, you know, customers are trying to utilize reuse systems, and they bring their own personal packaging to fill up at retail outlets. But the bulk packaging that's provided by the stores are not refillable or reusable. So I feel like it defeats the entire purpose. If that makes sense, if I'm explaining it well. So I would want to say we don't want to incentivize that type of system in Maryland. Thanks.
Are there any other public comments?
I just want to make sure. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, I wanted to pull up in the chat. Someone asked if we could send a link to the current draft regulation. The regulations that are currently available for public comment till March 9th, that were published on February 6th in the Maryland Register, are available online. And I'm going to put a link to the direct issue. You will have to scroll through the entire issue, but it's volume 53, issue 3. And if you would look if you're looking for the draft compliance guide associated with that, I will also put a link up to where those are. Any emails or notices or letters must be received by March 9th, and they should be directed to mde.epr@maryland.gov, or you can send them via snail mail, 1800 Washington Boulevard, Suite 610, Baltimore 21230. And as long as you identify that it's sent to Bradley Baker, that would be very helpful in making sure it goes to the right program. Is there any other feedback you wanted to provide, Sarah?
Yeah, I just wanted to also clarify that this current discussion that we're having in this meeting is not part of any official public comment process. So if you have comments, if you brought anything up in this meeting that is related to the regulations that are currently in the rulemaking process, which Shannon linked, please submit those via writing through the official and appropriate process. Thank you. That's it.
If there are no, oh, go ahead, Eileen.
I just wanted to ask one thing, Shannon. The last slide that we didn't have time to get to, could you guys consider at the top of our next meeting in 2 weeks, if we could go through that quickly amongst the group?
If there's no other public comments, we can actually go back to that one if that would be of interest. I just want to make sure we give the time for the public comment. But it does not seem like there's any other hands raised. And Martha's part of the advisory council. Unless you have...
Heidi Sanborn was here earlier, and it looks like she had to leave. If she sends in comments written, could you share that with the rest of the advisory council?
Yeah, that we would. That was the intention behind that homework.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. So Sarah, can you go back to the last slide, please? The one before that, I'm sorry. Eileen, to clarify, and just to let the advisory council know, again, we talked about the bag provisions. We mentioned about the specific labeling. Should there be a specific labeling requirement that is codified in rule that is relative to acceptable for it to be considered refillable or reusable? Should the department define rules regarding online retail or certain reuse packaging with the e-commerce? And hopefully that allows you time to review this. But again, this will be up and available online. We will work to get this up within 2 days with our communications program online. Seeing no other comments from the advisory council, I did want to point out the upcoming meeting that we have scheduled for Tuesday, March 17th will be from 9 to 11 Eastern Standard Time. We have sent out requests to certain stakeholders that we feel would provide some valuable insight. If you are a stakeholder and you feel like you would like to present something, please send an email immediately to mde.epr@maryland.gov, specifically on compostable cover materials, so that we can make sure that you are included in the next round of presentations. The next call after that would be regarding the actual list. So if you are looking at the list, the one we talked about before with rulemaking, now we're going to be talking about the physical list on April 21st. And then in the regarding producers. So the upcoming calls are not necessarily on rulemaking, again, addressing those 3 different categories. Should it be in rulemaking? Should it be part of advisory planning, the producer responsibility plans, or should it be in guidance? And so please make sure, even the topics we talked about at the beginning of this calendar year, looking in those different buckets as you evaluate your feedback to MDE on these topics. And then I just wanted to, Brad, if there's anything else you want to add? Otherwise, I was going to offer Mike or Angie the opportunity to share any concluding thoughts.
Sure. I'm going to turn it to Mike or Angie.
I don't know if Angie's here, but thank you all very much. Just a really good, robust conversation, and really appreciate all of you. Angie?
Yeah, I just want to second that. I think we're moving along quite nicely, and we're actually making progress. And, I'm really excited for the March 17th meeting coming up of compostable cover materials. I think that's going to be a really great discussion since the topic's been coming up nonstop. I do think the presenters that are going to be in that meeting will provide some really good insight, like Shannon had mentioned. And then I know everybody's super excited about the actual list. So, give your comments, please give your comments, take the time. I appreciate MDE giving us a little bit more time to really think about it and be able to provide the necessary comments. So I appreciate everybody in the group, on the committee. I think we're doing a great job, and I'm really excited to see the progress that we're making.
And thanks to all the presenters today. They did a very good job and informing all of us. Have a good day, folks.
Yeah, and just so everyone knows, we will not be sending out the same guidance questions at the upcoming meeting. We wanted this really to just give the floor to those that are the subject matter experts on these topics for compostable cover materials without really defining that overview. So, and again, thanks to both of the presenters today. We appreciate and value that, and we will have their slides up as soon as our communications program is able to do so. So thank you so much.
Bye-bye, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.